So what are the reasons to pay attention to different stakeholder perspectives? So first of all, I put this particular word cloud together from an RFP that we got from an institution, where they asked us to talk about how we tracked metadata in their organization. And these were all of the words that they used interchangeably within their RFP to talk about the repository for metadata. You know, a catalog, an inventory, business glossary, dictionary, data elements, data definitions, data sources, data sets, system of record, analytical data. You know, all of these things are in, and there was very little context to that. And this is just representative to me of the fact that this RFP that was put together by, you know, people from all across this institution who had aggregated with the procurement office to ask for things. There wasn't a lot of communication happening within that organization about what they wanted and what they were asking for. And there, in many ways, it was a shared, I hope and I believe, a shared purpose and goals around this. But the vocabulary and the specific practical implementation of governance was all over the place, and it was very difficult to figure out what they wanted and to communicate back effectively to them. And you know, that was just us as a vendor. That problem happens regularly at an institution. So there's really this rise of new data governance interest, which is great. We very much support that. But historically, like, we've been talking for several years. You know, we started going to the AIR conferences. Many of you sort of understood data governance. It's been a thing that's been in sort of in various language in the best practices of institutional research. If you read the documentation and the best practices books that come out from IR, they talk about these types of things. But you know, so IR has been a primary advocate for this. But you know, if you look at sort of what, you know, well, IR, the role within an organization has been one who, you know, understands the need for collaboration between offices, because it's very difficult to do institutional research without getting agreement from, you know, IT and the business office and all these things. So you really are focused on bringing together that institutional level data, and that's been a very valuable thing. The most common data governance action that we've seen driven from IR, which is a logical outcome of this need for collaboration, is a business glossary. But so, you know, hey, what do we agree on what is meant by, you know, FTE or retention rate or engagement or whatever those things are. The business glossary has been the primary drive for most of the organizations that we talk to. Now that extends from there, obviously, to other sort of uses, but primarily, again, the business glossary is the drive for IR. So in the last few years, it's likely that discussions of data governance needs have been originating from new areas in your institutions. Now, they may not call it data governance. They may use slightly different terminology. They may be talking about things like a data catalog or an inventory or master data management or other things like that. And but that's, you know, it's important to understand that that is happening independently from other things in your organization that is adjacent to, if not directly related to, your goals for data governance. Now, unfortunately, these broader data governance needs are rarely served by just a business glossary alone, right? So there are elements of the way that we recommend business, you know, best practices of implementing a business glossary that are directly applicable, but it is starting from a very different mindset and a very different approach than what these other people are looking at. So it's really important to understand that, or else you're going to end up with two different things. So, you know, this can lead to loss of momentum on the adoption of your IR governance initiatives, your glossary, or your data request process, or whatever it might be. You know, can lead to overall paralysis in the data governance planning, or siloed, and we can argue about whether that Windows tells me that's how you spell siloed. I'm not sure if that's true, but siloed initiatives that often conflict. You know, your business glossary isn't really what I want, so I'm going to have my own catalog, right? That's not a good outcome. The goal of governance is really to get everyone on the same page. So in this discussion, we're going to look at the broader data governance perspectives and how to avoid this conflict and loss of momentum, and how to leverage this new interest, which is great. We should think of this as a good thing. We're going to leverage this new interest into stronger institution-wide data governance for everyone that gets everyone excited and bought in. All right. So why do we want to pay attention to this outside of what I just said? So, you know, if you are kind of in an assessment and planning phase, which I encourage you to do if you haven't already, or if you're at a point where you've stalled in data governance, is to go back and look at an assessment and planning phase for data governance. Discovery, what are the challenges and needs for the use of data within your organization? How do you scope a data governance initiative around what problems that you're going to help or what systems you're going to implement? We'll talk about that. What's the feasibility of the data governance initiatives components you're going to do, and how do you prioritize those things? So outside of the assessment and planning, even if you're on the move, how do you maintain that momentum by avoiding misunderstandings about what we're doing or what people need, cultivate buy-in, support adoption, and recruiting data governance support from various folks? Right. This is just a little tease for the data governance assessment webinar that we gave, talking about how you get your leadership together, you assess the current data governance, talk about developing recommendations to be done, prioritize and scope that, build a roadmap, get some actionable pilot projects, and then measure the success. So if you're interested in figuring out how to do this, again, understanding the whole organization is a lot of what we're talking about here. You can go, we'll refer you to these other webinars and resources that we have available. So what is it about these other areas that cause conflict or siloed activities? There's a wide range of perceptions about what data governance should be doing and what it's used for. The most common disconnect is between this concept of the business glossary, focusing on what we're going to talk about is the data catalog. What's different about that? A report catalog or process catalog, lineage, policy attributes like privacy code, security classifications, data modeling, which is a totally different thing, master data management, which oftentimes gets lumped together, and that's one of the most common things where people get very confused. Master data management and data governance are at best adjacent. Data governance can feed master data management. Master data management is more about integration and constituent management, like the application of data synchronization, than it is about the governance, right, which we're talking about here, but that can be very confusing. Stewardship, quality, your BI, business intelligence and data warehousing needs, like how those things play into this and what people are trying to do there and how that fits in with governance, or regulatory reporting. So all those things can create disconnect on what you're trying to do. All right. So let's step back from that overview and say who are the different stakeholders. So within your organization, like from the sort of the jobs really the organization, you've got your institutional organizational research folks, which are really you guys, your IR folks. Your IT folks, it might be your system and database admins, system integrators, application developers, and other folks, network system people. Your BI and warehousing team, which might include data modelers, developers, analysts, report writing team. Your executive leadership, CEOs, presidents, boards. Business offices, your functional operational roles within your organization, like your registrar or your HR group. Self-service reporting that's happening within that group, people in their interest. Information officers, if you're lucky enough to have like a chief data officer, or most people have a CIO that hopefully includes these kind of interests. That's another part of your executive leadership that's important. Security and risk managers, these people have very specific needs that they want out of data governance. It's often not directly addressed by what IR might think or what IT might think. Data aggregator, so you might be reporting to a consortium or a state level school or some sort of benchmarking organization. And those people have data that they collect and they have their own needs and expectations for what they want out of data standards and data governance as well. And then you might have external compliance or oversight. So maybe you've got auditors coming in who are saying you must have X, Y, and Z, or you have regulatory agencies that are asking for certain things from a governance standpoint. So those are your general kind of organizational roles that you have to consider when thinking about these other perspectives within your organization. So what can we assume about their perspectives? And we're not going to be able to go into depth on all of them. The first thing, in my very dad joke way here, if you saw my webinar, I told this dad joke before. But I remember, here we have JVC, RCA, and Sonia. I mentioned that I'm going to make assumptions about what these people or what these roles want, right? These assumptions are not 100% true and are not 100% accurate. They're just generalizations. And I will agree that, hey, that's a stereotype, right? I'm stereotyping these people like JVC and RCA and Sony. This is my bad dad joke, and I am a dad, I will admit. So take that as a grain of salt. This is a generalization. Your organization may be different. You may have people who have different needs and wants, but the thing is, you'll never know until you talk to them. So hopefully that's what you're doing, and that's a big takeaway here, is to think about what other people's needs are. But for the general sense, I think there is some consistency for what people are looking for. All right. So if we look at this breakdown of IT, IR, BI, executive leadership, business offices, your information officers, security, data aggregators, and all that, one of the first things is to look at what are the symptoms and goals. Like, what are the data challenges, needs, and actionable goals of this group here, right? And then that will lead to also what data governance best practices you should develop. So what are the content needs and scope, and data governance activities, tasks, and framework you should implement, and then how you should prioritize the scope of within the organization, within the systems and tools, and within the individual and role involvement. And then how do you sort of judge their readiness and adoption? So of these people, like, even if you think that they have a high value prioritization, what's their readiness, the process maturity and tolerance and concerns and doubts about data governance. Okay, so let's go into each one of these here. So the first is systems and goals. All right. So one way when we talk about our assessment is to look at these data challenges and needs, which we often call symptoms, right? These issues that people are having with use of data, issues with access to data, questions about ownership, knowledge and data literacy, data quality issues, consistency, accuracy, trust, security, timeliness, or latency, like how long does it take to get reports, the ability to communicate on issues, or to even know who to ask to get things, or something that's not even in this, some new sort of thing. So those are sort of symptoms, and there could be specific cases of that come out, and that can relate to what I'm calling actionable goals, which is that people want sort of faster data request turnaround, or getting more use of existing reporting tools, or improved training and data for current and new hires, or satisfying compliance requirements. So if you think about, these are the things that if you ask the people within your organization, what are the challenges to using data, they might say, my challenge is it takes too long to get a report back, or I don't have access to this, or maybe it's people shouldn't have access to things that they have, or the data quality is awful, or whatever. I don't know what the data is, or I don't know, I don't know who's in charge of this, or I don't have all these sorts of things are the symptoms. If you were to fix those problems, the goals would be that you could get, faster data request turnaround. You could get new data systems implemented faster and better. You could have better self-service reporting. You could handle regulatory reporting burdens faster. You could eliminate duplicate effort. These types of actionable goals. So it's important to measure and understand what those are when you're implementing data governance, and that the things that you're doing, be it institutional research implementing a business glossary, or considering these other things we're going to talk about, that they actually serve towards an actionable, measurable goal. Have we improved the trust in the data? Are we able to get reports out faster? Did we satisfy the audit requirements for X, Y, and Z? All those things are critically important to measuring the goals and removing those sort of named symptoms of problems. Okay. So that's your symptoms and goals. The next thing, once you've identified that, is to determine what are the data governance best practices. So we like to talk about in best practices that there's this framework and there's the content. And the framework is that you have a defined data stewardship, a shared knowledge base, well understood processes, and general data governance oversight, right? Regardless of what content we're talking about. And then from a content perspective, right, you're going to have a bunch of different things which we'll talk about later, like is it data quality, or is it a business glossary, or is it a data system inventory, all those types of things. Within your data governance framework, we're going to talk about that first. We mentioned first a set of organizational roles, IT, your chief data officer, your IR office, your BI group, all those things. Those groups sort of roll into data governance roles. And that is your sort of consumers and requesters of data, analysts and report creators, data stewards, either functional or technical, data governance leadership, or champions over data governance, and then subject matter experts, are either technical or business unit or policy experts. So there's sort of a mapping from those organizational roles, which have very specific needs, into these sort of actionable data governance roles, and those have two different things. So when I'm talking about the interest of these, job titles within your organization, it's different than the data governance roles and the activities they have to take, right? There may be some crossover, but we're mainly focused now on what is the concern of an IT person, right? Which may map into a technical data steward or a subject matter expert. But I just wanted to point out that we're not really talking about these governance roles specifically. We're talking about the organizational roles in terms of perspective. We do a whole session on that too, which we can talk about later. So that's the framework piece. Now from the content, you've got business glossary, technical and functional definitions, your data system catalog, which is like information about all the different data systems that you have, the technical metadata there, tagging or supplemental information about that data, like, what is, privacy codes or classifications or additional, clarification or definitions of the things that are in your data systems. Data processing catalog, which might be considered a report catalog. I'd like to expand that though to say that documentation or understanding of all the different reports you have, but also things like ETLs, moving data from one process to another, or surveys or APIs, all that kind of stuff. Lineage, your data requests, the data request process and the actual managing requests. Data ownership that includes your sort of functional area assignments for things. Oh, this is a registrar term or an HR term. The domain with which those live, as I just said, and who are the stewards over that, and what are the sort of classifications around that ownership. Data quality, understanding the if there's any data quality issues, either real or perceived. What's the assessments of that data quality, the actual rules defined for that, and monitoring of that. Reference data, understanding the management of your reference data, your list of code values or valid values or statuses and things like that. Mappings between systems and monitoring of whether or not those things have changed. Policy attributes, which is important. This is about, be it your data system or your report or your business glossary, adding things, putting attributes on those around, security classification, privacy codes, data sharing agreements, data retention policies, data access rules, all those types of things. Managing changes and versioning and item dependency across all this stuff. Dealing with external data standards like, IPEDS or the Common Data Set or the state of, Texas, the Texas Higher Education Commission definitions or whatever those things might be. And then also just managing your overall policies and procedure documentation, not just the attributes, but like what is our, what are the set of standards that we have for privacy or data retention and things like that. So those are all your sets of content that we've talked about that you need to manage holistically. And as I mentioned, IR often focus on business glossary and maybe the report catalog and the data request. That's a lot of what people have done in our data cookbook world. That's fallen into what we call our knowledge edition, which is really very like glossary and narrative focused. And what we're seeing is a lot more interest now, growing interest in this data system catalog, the technical details, and tracking those very, very carefully and governing those, not just acknowledging the existence of it and siloed documentation of it, but bringing that into an institutional governance of that, as well as lineage and quality and things that really bring technical components to the forefront of that. And there are tools that focus very specifically on things like lineage and quality and metadata management, right? And there are tools that focus on glossary and requests and things like that and stewardship. What we offer with our tool is the thing that brings all those things together. And what I would like you to think about is whether or not if you started off focusing just on glossary and a few of these narrative type things, are you running to a point where you're not getting much of adoption because your organization is, the rest of your organization is looking at these other components, right? And how do you bring that in? And also, how hard is that to do, right? We'll get to in a minute. All right, so that's talking about the best practices and how to think about that. Now we're going to talk about scope and priority. So, if you look at your organization and you say, well, we've got my framework, here's this sort of stewardship and knowledge, here's the different content, then I've got my different business areas and I've got the different tools and different individuals. It's also important to think about as you roll things out, like what's the perspective and the need and the prioritization of those things? Do we want to focus on glossary and these areas and these tools and these people, right? You want to build something that can grow into covering everything in the whole organization, but also prioritizing the right set of people. This is something that we talk about in our Getting Started with Data Governance and our assessment and prioritization workshop. There's a lot that goes into this, but I just want to bring this up as we think about the perspective of everyone, understanding their need, their goals, their readiness is important to say, how do you prioritize your overall governance? Okay. So you do want to prioritize this thing based on sort of, what content and what areas within your organization, what system and tools within your organization, what people in your organization you want to bring into this, based on their impact on the data challenges and needs, right? If the challenge is that you're not getting reports out fast enough, then you want to make sure that you're prioritizing that. Impact on the actionable goals. People trust the data. Those types of things we talked about are actionable. The feasibility, or is this something that can be easily done? Because low-hanging fruit kind of thing gets high priority. Desire of the team. If you've got an executive that says it's really, really important that you get the HR data right, but the HR team is limited in resources and very focused on payroll, and frankly, it's just not going to work. That's important. And so all that factors in the return on investment. So the goal here is that you should not build on sort of another silo of data. You should not, you don't have to try to solve this at once. You can build into it, but you do need to understand those things, right? And so the important note is here that you sort of cannot solve it all at once, but you need to try to make sure that everyone is heard and understood, and you have a roadmap that gets to them. Right, so the last piece here is to talk about readiness and adoption. So, if you've gone through and listened to the perspective, you can understand their sort of maturity and tolerance for new processes. They may not be ready to say we're going to insert some documentation or some approval or some definitions into your process, but they may be very ready, more ready than you think, or they may have a process that could be easily adapted to this. Understand what their concerns and doubts are about implementing data governance. They may say not another documentation effort. We've been through that again. I'm not going to do it. Right? And that can go into feasibility, right? Could also be something you can educate them with. But talking to all these people can help you find advocates and champions and volunteers for your governance initiative, right? As long as you understand and acknowledge what their needs are, and if you can't get to it right now, say that you can handle it later. So how do you apply this information, right? So first of all, you want to sort of educate in data governance, right? Make sure that you understand here are the goals that everyone has sort of enumerated and what we're trying to do, and here's the roadmap. And we're not going to get to the quality for advancement yet, but we're going to do that later, and what we're doing now is important for that. Help build the buy-in as you talk to everyone, get adoption and cooperation from people, let them know that they are heard, their needs will be addressed in the roadmap, and then provide training, right? Governance tasks and pathways, and access to documentation. What I mean by this governance tasks and pathways is that people have an entry point for their data governance needs, right? And this will all help fight that loss of momentum. Right, so we have about 10 minutes left. Let's hop into it. So what's a good place to start? Now, your organization might be different. Again, we're making assumptions, stereotyping again, probably here. But we do believe that, the business glossary, kind of a data request report process often focus on this functional information, system agnostic information, which is really important. The data catalog stuff that you might hear about focuses on very technical information or system-specific information, right? So here you've got your business glossary with functional technical definitions, and your data system catalog with system details, technical data models, tagging, essentially the information is coming from those data systems, and then overlaying it with tags, right? So there are parts of your organization that are very focused on these things, and parts of your organization that are very focused on these things. So bringing these things together creates an enormous amount of value. And part of that might be thinking I'm going to pull these technical definitions out of just my narrative business glossary. And the technical definition is saying I've got a definition for what active student is, and I say, oh, in our data warehouse, active student is in this table in this field or whatever. And you might just have a narrative description of that, explaining what someone should do in a text box, right? But what we want to do is to pull that out and basically say, hey, we can actually point that to the data system catalog and say, you know what, it actually lives in this particular field. So if you've got that documentation, if you've got that metadata somewhere in your data governance repository, it makes it a lot easier to write data technical definitions. Also, the flip side of that is that if someone's trying to supplement their documentation of their data warehouse or their ERP system or whatever, and they're writing kind of an explanation about what these fields are, if it is related to a business glossary term, having this link can be really useful in the other direction as well. So and the other thing is policy attributes. So adding your security, this is often a big need. Your data access, steps and rules security classification, privacy codes, data sharing agreements, retention policy, data retention policies, and those things. That these are things that can be associated with glossary, but also associated with data system catalog. So you don't necessarily have to have a glossary entry for some data field in one of the databases. You can just sort of put that attribute on that data field directly. But if you do have a glossary entry, you can also have it there, which is important. So these two things become really useful. And so the point, again, of starting with the data system catalog, and this might be a little flip, and this is, I admit to like a change in my thinking about this, because we used to think and promote, start with business glossary, grow into the other things. But the reality is that a business glossary takes a lot of time and effort to develop, but a data catalog with the right tools is something that can be done really quickly. And frankly, you know, a data catalog is kind of non-controversial. You know, whatever your priorities are, if they're related to quality or privacy or security, having a data catalog content will help serve that. You know, glossary as well to a certain point, but the data catalog is really easy to come in. So when I think about it, there's a high return on investment on that. Now, what we hear from IR folks, or folks that have sort of started with business glossary and these things, it's like, you know, that technical stuff is hard. We want to just start with this and then we'll add technical later. I get it, but you know, I'm going to challenge you and say, like, is it though? Is it really that hard? Like, what might be hard is just, you know, the communication and the adoption and the involvement of these IT folks. But understand now that what's different than maybe 4 or 5 years ago is that these people are looking for data catalog tools. And if you can get them to know that your concept of data governance is inclusive of their data catalog interest, and you can help them solve that problem in something that works with your solution, it's going to be great. And also, you might discover that, frankly, this data catalog stuff is a lot easier than you thought, even easier than your glossary thing. So my recent kind of comparison here for catalog versus glossary is that you think of the catalog information as like your blood pressure or your breathing, right? This is something that exists within your organization without having to think about it. You know, you have bought this ERP system from this vendor. You bought this CRM from this vendor. Your BI team has developed this data warehouse, right? There's all this content that's there, right? And just a little bit of technical details to like connect that content up, you can consume that. So your data catalog content takes a small amount of technical setup, like this automatic blood pressure monitoring thing. But someone doesn't have to think about what my blood pressure is and consult with 5 different people on what their blood pressure is. The blood pressure is what the blood pressure is. So if you've got this thing that monitors that, it can pull that information in and have it run automatically and be updated on a regular basis. And you can tell if someone's about to lose their mind because their blood pressure is crazy, but you don't have to ask them. It's just something that happens automatically. And that's kind of what data catalog information can do. Now, glossary content or other things, this is more like an art, right? So it requires orchestration, collaboration, and ongoing human effort. You're making decisions. You're thinking of, you know, very you know, well described definitions of things that are very specific, and getting agreement from your whole organization. So, you know, done right, it's a beautiful thing and it's very powerful, but it's high effort. And frankly, it's benefited by the information in the catalog. So while glossary is important, and I'm not saying don't do glossary, there is a real value to these things at the same time. And if you've only been focusing on glossary and maybe hit a dead end because, you know what, you're out of energy to make a new painting or to orchestrate your flute section is on strike or whatever, like, you know, this is where bringing this catalog information can really